This is a CBC News special presentation.
Canada and the world are now facing new uncertainty, this time caused by a war in Europe that has upended rules-based international order. Like other nations, Canada is being called on to step up and boost its defense spending to reach NATO's target. Russia's war on Ukraine has impacts here at home too, where many Canadians were already being priced out. Inflation is at a 30-year high. The cost of living, food, and gas is becoming unmanageable for many.
Just totally outrageous. Just jacks everything else up.
They're going up pretty significantly, which is really hard when you're on a fixed income.
The threat of climate change also looms over this moment, with the UN warning the world is on track to becoming unlivable, and there is an urgent need to act now. The fight against COVID is still not over. Businesses are back up and running, restrictions largely lifted, but Canadians' lives have changed, and the Liberal government has already moved to expand the social safety net, like new spending to tackle housing, daycare, and kickstart dental care. Some of these progressive policies are ones the Liberal minority government has committed to in exchange for the NDP's support, part of a historic deal between the two parties. This budget is a test for the government to show how it will respond to growing global challenges and the needs of Canadians at home. This is the Federal Budget 2022.
Hello and welcome to our CBC News Budget Special. I'm Rosemary Barton here in the nation's capital. We are standing by for the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister to make their way into the House of Commons, where Chrystia Freeland will table her second budget. This budget, in many ways, the first post-pandemic budget, at least when it comes to emergency measures, as we know. So many people still coping with a sixth wave in many parts of this country. Our team standing by to break it all down, of course, and we'll have lots of people here to help analyze the numbers and the areas in this budget, what it means for you. We're expecting all that to get underway in just a few moments' time. As well, we are going to have David Cochrane with the details shortly, and Vashi Kapelisis with lots of analysis. The Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister is speaking right now. Let's listen in.
The lowest debt to GDP in the G7, and actually the lowest deficit in the G7.
What are you saying to Canadians exactly at this point about your budget? We are there to continue to have people's backs. We understand that the cost of living is going up, and we want to help them with housing. We want to help them to get green jobs, and we also want to help them with their expenses, but at the same time remaining responsible and creating growth.
And there we go, short comments from the Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, and of course the Prime Minister as well. That budget will be tabled in just moments inside the House of Commons, at which point we can tell you what has been under embargo for most of the day. And David Cochrane has been looking through the documents and the numbers, as have I. Vashi Kapelisis is here. She, of course, is the host of Power and Politics, and we'll have more coverage later on. But Vashi, first of all, I guess we'll just ask sort of what the expectations are in terms of what the government has already telegraphed for this budget.
Well, they've telegraphed a lot, so I feel like we can set our expectations pretty specifically and pretty high. They have telegraphed the areas of spending we can anticipate to see action on, more specifically housing, and that's where the affordability piece comes into it. Childcare, we already know the deals have been struck. That'll be in there. Because of the deal with the NDP, there will be something on dental care as well. And then given the moment that we're in this world right now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there will also be a boost to defense spending. The devil, of course, will be in the details, as we so often hear in these times. We'll be looking to see over what period of time all this new spending takes place, where fundamentally it goes. For example, in housing, is it directed primarily towards supply, as they've telegraphed, or will there be some measures on the demand side as well? And then overall, I think the narrative that they have certainly projected is that it's something back to basics. It's not the pandemic level of spending. My question, of course, as we look towards the unveiling of this budget, the tabling of it, is to what degree does it go back to what things were before the pandemic. You know, the critics of the government say it's still going to be big spend no matter what, thanks to the agreement with the NDP. We'll see what the Liberals' answer to that is.
Yeah, and I guess a couple of components to keep in mind for people too, Vashi, is that there is increased revenue for the government right now, in large part because of the oil and gas prices in this country, which are benefiting the coffers for the government. So they have a little bit of room there. Just to remind people that when we last had an update back in December, the deficit was slated to be $144 billion. So we'll see what the projections are like now. But one of the things I expect that they will address, as you talked about, and that the Conservatives will certainly want to press them on, are issues around inflation. Certainly government spending contributes to inflation, but what the government is going to do to help people in the immediate, in the right now, to deal with some of those affordability issues.
Yeah, and those affordability issues are, as you point out, very real for Canadians. When you go to fill up your car, when you go to the grocery store, I mean, inflation in February was 5.7%. That's the highest it's been. That's the biggest increase in prices since 1991, rather. So I am very curious as well to see what specifically is in there to help with that. The opposition parties, specifically the Conservatives, have said you should offer some kind of tax break. We haven't seen any signal that that's coming down the pipe, but it seems as though that will be, you know, part of the calculus in whatever the Liberals determined to do here. It's hard to ignore that that's a pressing issue for Canadians right now.
For sure. And you're just looking inside the House of Commons there. I saw copies of the budget being handed out. We'll just listen in for a moment.
My Lord. My Lord, order. Come, Ile Cesar.
4 p.m. 4:10 p.m. the House will now proceed to the consideration of Ways and Means Proceedings number 3 concerning the budget presentation.
Orders of the day, government orders, consideration of Ways and Means motion number 3 concerning the budgetary policy of the government. Ms. Freeland, seconded by Mr. Boissonneau, moves that this House approve in general the budgetary policy of the government. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 83-1, I would like to table in both official languages the budget documents for 2022, including the notices of Ways and Means motions. Les détails.
The details concerning the measures included therein are set out in these documents, and pursuant to Standing Order 83-2, I request that the study of these motions be listed on the orders of the day.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker,
they have now been officially tabled and is lifted. We'll listen for a couple of moments to Minister Freeland and then go to David Cochrane for some details.
Just over 2 years ago, when our travel plans were hastily canceled, when our children came home from school, when we all rushed to the grocery stores to buy toilet paper and hand sanitizer. We realized then that this virus would disrupt our lives. But few of us imagined quite how much or for quite how long.
Come back to the Deputy Prime Minister as her speech goes on. But first, let's go to David Cochrane. He's been in the lockup, as have I. And he will give us some of the details, and then we'll go to Vashi, who will have some analysis as well. David, go ahead.
Yeah, Rosie, Chrystia Freeland is not tabling a balanced budget today, but what she is attempting is a bit of a balancing act. She's trying to bend the deficits and the fiscal track back to those pre-pandemic levels, while also putting billions of dollars in new spending to deal with the urgent problems of today. She said in the foreword to her budget that Canada has a proud tradition of fiscal responsibility. It is my duty to maintain it, and I will. And I want to start there. I want to show you the fiscal track that the country is now on in this budget. The monstrous deficits. You referenced $144.5 billion the last time we saw something for the 2021 numbers, now down to $113. And you can see for the current fiscal year, it's $52 billion and then rapidly declining over time to about $8.4 billion by 2026, 2027. So you can see the need for the emergency COVID spending is over. Revenue is up. The deficit is down, but there is extra spending there, and I'll walk you through some of those key areas, starting with housing. There's $10 billion in spending over 5 years on housing, including $4 billion to launch a housing accelerator fund. The overall goal is to double the rate of housing construction over the next 10 years, and that housing accelerator, they hope to create 100,000 houses over the next 5 years. There's also a one-time payment of $500 for low-income people struggling with housing affordability. Now, that's on the supply side to some degree. To help people buy homes, the government is also creating a tax-free first home savings account. This is something they promised in the last election, and it works like an RRSP. When the money goes in, you get to deduct that money from you get the tax credit of an RRSP when you invest into the savings fund, and then when you pull the money out, the investment income is tax-free, just like a tax-free savings account. They're also talking about developing a home buyer's bill of rights and imposing a 2-year ban on foreign home buying. There's also an acute emphasis on innovation spending here, including the creation of a $15 billion Canada Growth Fund, $15 billion over 5 years. The goal there is to foster investment in clean and green transition sectors, and the hope is that that $15 billion can leverage another $45 billion of investment, because one of the things they say in the briefings we had, Rosie, is that Canada's short-term growth projections look good, but medium and long-term are poor, with the OECD ranking Canada near the bottom. There's a global fight for capital to help with the clean transition. That's what this is about, as is the $3.8 billion to implement a critical mineral strategy. The goal there be to get the raw materials you need for things like car batteries. The other big area of spending is on defense. There's $8 billion there in new spending. They're also going to launch a strategic defense policy review to update the needs and requirements for Canada's armed forces. That $8 billion, there's not a lot of specifics as to exactly where that's going to go. It's money that's being earmarked for future investments in NATO and NORAD. There's also $875 million over 5 years beginning to address cyber threats. But another area where there's an immediate infusion of spending is in Ukraine. There's $500 million in this budget for military aid to Ukraine, lethal and non-lethal, as well as another $1 billion put on the table in loan resources to the Ukrainian government to stabilize the payroll and economic integrity of a country that has been invaded by Vladimir Putin. So extra financial support there for Ukraine. And one final thing I'll touch on, Rosie. Jagmeet Singh, come on down. You got your dental care program. $5.3 billion over 5 years. The line in the budget is essentially a copy and paste from what we saw in the NDP Liberal agreement. It starts with under 12s in 2022, expands to under 18s, seniors and people with disabilities by next year. Full implementation by 2025, though, will be restricted to people who make less than $90,000 with no co-pays for people under $70,000. So this is Chrystia Freeland's answer to the crisis of the day to deal with the affordability crisis with housing, the pre-announced childcare, the climate crisis through innovation and transition, and extra defense spending and help for Ukraine to deal with the crisis in Ukraine.
But largely a budget, and I will just dip back into the Deputy Prime Minister, largely a budget that returns to, I wouldn't say pre-pandemic levels, but it is more in the vein of perhaps of what Canadians are used to, rather than hundreds of billions of dollars spent per year. Here's a little bit more of Chrystia Freeland before we go to more analysis.
But our ability to spend is not infinite. The time for extraordinary COVID support is over. And we will review and reduce government spending, because that is the responsible thing to do. On this point, Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear. We are absolutely determined that our debt to GDP ratio must continue to decline. Our deficits must continue to be reduced. The pandemic debt we incurred to keep Canadians safe and solvent must be paid down, and it is being paid down.
That is the finance minister there addressing some of the concerns that certainly we're going to hear from this person. That is the interim leader of the Conservative Party, Candice Bergen, about what the fiscal guardrails are when it comes to spending. Let's listen to get some reaction here.
No plan for long-term growth or productivity. We are seeing taxes go up, which in the end, Canadians, everyday Canadians, will be paying for. And we're seeing a housing program announced, as in typical Liberal fashion, that will actually result in not one house built or one house purchased this year. It is an irresponsible budget. It is a typical classic NDP spend and tax budget. Another thing to observe is with every budget that these Liberals deliver, they spend more, which results in the cost of everything going up. So I'm very concerned that with their increased spending, everything will continue to go up. It's not a good budget. It's an irresponsible budget. Conservatives will not be supporting it, and we will be doing all we can to work for Canadians to see taxes decreased and Canadians supported through a very difficult time of increased inflation.
Did you like the more money for defense?
Well, we like the announcement of more money for defense. We have to see if it will actually happen. We already have a government that has announced about $10 billion in defense spending that they actually haven't spent. So yes, we actually passed a motion yesterday that asked for an increase in defense spending. So we're glad to see it in the budget, but we're going to be looking for where they're going to be spending it and that they'll actually get that money out. Well, that's a lot of money, but we'd rather see a shift in defense spending than them clawing back. So, you know, this is the problem. When times are good, this government spends and spends some more, and then when things happen, like whether it's a pandemic or the invasion in Ukraine, they don't have the money to do what they need to do. So, listen, we're happy to see that announcement, but overall the budget is not a responsible budget. Sorry, I'm having a little hard time hearing you. The Ukraine spending? We are very supportive of any support that we can give to the Ukraine. I think, though, the challenge is, you know, you hear some of the horrific stories, you see that what's happening in Ukraine, and they're actually asking for some specific weapons and things that the Canadian government could give them. The government's not doing that. So as much as we support anything that we can do to help people in Ukraine, there's more things the government can do, and so we're going to be pushing them to do those things. What we asked for was not, we didn't say no-fly zone. We recognize that that terminology has certain implications. What we are asking for, and we believe, is that the humanitarian corridors should be protected. Whether that is Ukraine themselves protecting those corridors, and there are things that we can do in Canada and other allied nations to help Ukraine, or whether it is protecting their airspace. But we've been very specific in what we've asked for that, and we think it's responsible for countries, including Canada, to be talking about that. I will ask Gerard to come and answer any questions.
We will leave this part of the scrum with the interim Conservative leader, Candice Bergen, calling this budget irresponsible. Just one point in terms of what she said about aid to Ukraine, that Ukraine is looking for increased military weapons and lethal weapons and non-lethal weapons from Canada. In fact, the budget does provide an additional $500 million to provide further military aid to Ukraine. Obviously, Canada would have to go and procure those weapons because we are sort of tapped out, but there is money allocated for that. Let's talk a little bit more about what we've heard so far, and I'll bring back David and Vashi. Vashi getting up to speed here on the budget, but I know you're good at that and fast at that. So I'll just get some initial thoughts from you on the size of it, because honestly, it is. I know maybe people don't remember how thick the last year's one was, but it's a thin budget, and the Conservatives may not like the spending, but I think that there was an expectation there would be even more spending, and that may have been the government sort of setting the trying to lower expectations around that.
Yeah, I think it's 200 and some pages versus 700 and some pages. You both can correct me if I'm wrong, but that is a big difference from the last one. And I think the way that you frame that is exactly right. They are benefiting from, I don't know if they're lower expectations or higher expectations, but different expectations than what ended up being delivered today. I think that the assumption and the line of critique in particular from the opposition Conservatives has for so long, you know, as we emerge from the pandemic, being that the spending has got to stop at the level that it's been at. Yeah. And so when it does, although it's still a lot of spending, it's not a tiny amount of spending. It's not like there's massive amounts of restraint being shown, but when it is less, than the record spending that we saw over the last 2 years, which understandably happened given what was going on during the pandemic. I think the Liberals are able to frame it, and especially the finance minister, in the way she did. I'd point to David's comments right off the top there in the remarks that she made, where she highlights a number of times the idea of fiscal responsibility. This is clearly the way that she conceives of it. I don't know if the opposition is going to be satisfied with that. As we just heard from the leader of the Conservatives, Candice Bergen, it doesn't appear that they are. But certainly, I think if you were to look at Canadians writ large, their expectations were they're going to be going boom, 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 spending wherever they can. And because that happened to a lesser degree, and I'm not absolving it or anything, but to a lesser degree, the Liberals maybe successfully telegraphed what they wanted to in advance of the budget so that they could emerge with this from this vantage point.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the spending, I think what we put all in was about $30 billion, which is nothing to sneeze at, but is quite different than the levels we were talking about during the pandemic. The deficit now down to $113 billion, and by the time we get to 2025-26, we're at $18 billion in deficit, which, again, yes, nothing to brag about, but we are a far cry from the $350 billion where we were through the pandemic, and the government believes they're moving in the right direction. So, I hear the Conservatives saying this is irresponsible, David, but perhaps they're not addressing the issues around affordability and inflation in the immediate, because some of these things are going to take some time to put in place, notably the housing part of this, because this is a budget very much about trying to make housing more affordable. Yeah, so program spending last year was $473 billion. It's down to $425 billion this year. That's a big drop, and a lot of that is the pandemic stuff. Now, the $30 billion, that's a net increase in spending over the next 5 years. So there is new spending, but it's not anything like the monstrous sort of fiscal response we had to see over the last little while, simply because that emergency is not there. But it's not all spend. There are some cuts coming. There's a spending review. They're going to review existing spending plans to reduce the space and scale of spending that is yet to occur by up to $3 billion over the next 4 years. And they're going to do a strategic policy review of programs to save about $6 billion over that time frame as well. And there are some tax hikes in this, Rosie, which Candice Bergen was talking about. And these are aimed at banks and insurance companies. There's a one-time 15% essentially windfall tax on income over $1 billion for last year, because the financial sector and the insurance sector did really well during the pandemic. And so they're going to go take some of that, and they're permanently going to increase their corporate tax rate from 15% to 16.5%. And they think this is going to raise about $6 billion over the next 5 years. And there's other things they're looking at, like cracking down on tax avoidance, looking at a minimum tax for wealthy earners in Canada. A lot of things the New Democrats have been talking about on that side. I'm assuming this is what Candice Bergen is talking about. But, the criticism we heard there from the interim Conservative leader, I think we could have kind of anticipated in advance. They're not doing enough of the things we like. They're doing too much of the things we don't like, and Jagmeet Singh is really driving this budget and steering it into a financial cliff. I'm not exactly sure that's how it's going to be viewed, because there's kind of two goals in this budget, to reassure Main Street that we can help you with dental, childcare, and housing, and to reassure Bay Street that they're getting back on a good fiscal track, and they're bending in a direction that I think financial markets will find more comforting than what we saw over the last couple of years. Yeah, and excuse me, I didn't mean $30 billion. I meant the difference in the spending over the years, not $30 billion overall. It does speak to, though, I guess, this issue around affordability, and I know you're just catching up here, Vashi, but these issues for housing, for instance, if we take a look at them, just because you mentioned this right off the top, it does seem to be primarily geared towards supply, and that's certainly something the finance minister was saying during the lockup, while there is also some additional measures, as you're seeing there, to help people get into the market. There's this one-time payment of $500 for people who are struggling with housing affordability. And then they follow through on a number of things that they committed to in the election, whether it's the tax-free first home savings account that's sort of like a TFSA for saving for your home. There's a multi-generational home renovation tax credit if you want to create a space for your parents or your grandparents in your home. All those things are fine, but I don't know that they're sort of long-term plans. And again, the finance minister made it really clear that this is not a silver bullet for the housing market, that there is only so much that a government can do when it comes to this.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, there's only so much they can do, especially on the supply side in the near future. It takes time to build hundreds of thousands of homes. The concern is the levers that they're using on the demand side. Will they end up? I mean, obviously, first-time buyers would like some help. It's impossible to get into the market in most places, in many places, I should say, in this country. But do they, in effect, end up driving prices more because demand will continue to outpace supply? So I think that is something to watch for. And I imagine if there is something the NDP criticizes going forward, it might be, yes, we got dental care, but in the near future, when we are facing the levels of inflation we're facing right now, the cost of living we are facing right now, there isn't something in here specifically that will help me tomorrow, right? And yes, that they are constrained in certain respects, but for example, the Conservatives have said, what about some sort of rebate on some portion of the tax that we pay on some item, for example, gas? I know there's a provincial portion of that too, and some provinces have gone down that road. But certainly I imagine that's a line of criticism or a line of questioning that the government will continue to face. And just really quickly, I did want to point out that they are buoyed this time and able to show the restraint that they did, largely because they are, if you call it restraint, whatever it is, largely because they have so much extra revenue, because oil prices have gone up, because the economy has rebounded so much so since the pandemic, or since the sort of end of the pandemic, that income tax revenue has gone up so much and other tax revenue has gone up so much that they were able to take that extra revenue and direct it towards the program spending that they did, or towards paying the deficit down faster than we anticipated they would as of last fall.
Yeah, and of course, as we've both been saying, the pandemic is not over, but the restrictions around the pandemic are largely over in this country, and that is why
that's a better way to put it. Yeah,
that's why the economy is moving in the right direction. We're just going to dip back to the West Bloc, where the Bloc Québécois leader, Yves-François Blanchet, is reacting now.
If you want it to work better, you give us a call. So obviously, we cannot accept that, and I'm anxious to see what Quebec's reaction will be. And now seniors, this is fabulous. Seniors. Well, basically, the government has said, no, not 1 cent more. We have a little table here in the budget. Justin Trudeau is saying to seniors, you have plenty of money, we will not give you more, in spite of the fact that there's inflation, which is very significant at this time. And I presume that seniors in Quebec and Canada will hear that message. The third condition that we set was to bring in support measures for businesses that had to adjust to inflation and to supply chain disruption in particular, because of the war, for example. There's nothing in there for that. Now, there are long-term perspectives and prospects, and the words fit the figures, and the figures fit the words. This is a budget that talks about a lot of problems, talks about issues, but doesn't actually bring forward any solutions. There are footnotes that they refer to, but there are absolutely no solutions here. And number 4, green financing. Well, couldn't be any further away from that. There is absolutely nothing in here, nothing clear, because it's fine to put figures in a budget.
That's Yves-François Blanchet criticizing the budget. Of course, we know because of this Liberal NDP deal, the Bloc can happily vote against the budget if it wants, knowing that there will not be an election. Let's go back inside the House of Commons, where the Deputy Prime Minister is speaking.
And turn their new ideas into new businesses and new jobs. Mr. Speaker, these 3 pillars, investing in people, investing in the green transition, and investing in innovation and productivity, will create jobs and prosperity today and build a stronger economic future for our kids. They will make life more affordable, and they will ensure Canada continues to be the best place in the world to live, work, and raise a family.
From the first day we started working on this budget, this growth agenda was always going to be our focus. And then Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. On that dark morning of February 24th, a day of
Okay, we're going to say goodbye now to viewers in
woke up
Newfoundland
to
on
a
CBC
world
Television. Special
utterly
coverage continues for the rest of the country on CBC
When
and CBC
Putin
News Network.
opened fire on the people of Ukraine, he also turned his guns on the unprecedented era of prosperity that the world's democracies had worked so diligently to build over more than 76 years. Our rules-based international order, built from the ashes of the Second World War, today confronts the greatest threat since its inception. And so, our response has been swift and strong. Canada and our allies have imposed the toughest sanctions ever inflicted on a major economy. Russia has become an economic pariah. But the mutilated people of Bucha, shot with their hands tied behind their backs, have shown us that is not enough. Putin and his henchmen are war criminals. The world's democracies, including our own, can be safe only once the Russian tyrant and his armies are entirely vanquished. And that is what we are counting on the brave people of Ukraine to do. Because they are fighting our fight, a fight for democracy. It is in our own urgent national interest to ensure that they have the missiles and the money they need to win. And that is what this budget helps to provide. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has also reminded us that our own peaceful democracy, like all the democracies of the world, depends ultimately on the defense of hard power. The world's dictators should never mistake our civility for pacifism. We know that freedom does not come for free, and that peace is guaranteed only by our readiness to fight for it. That is why we are making an immediate additional investment in our armed forces and propose a swift defense policy review to equip Canada for a world that has become more dangerous. This budget will help provide the fiscal and physical firepower we need to meet any threat that may confront us. And we understand that security includes energy security, which Canada must work to ensure for ourselves and our democratic partners. C'est pourquoi nous
All right, that is
investissons.
the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister delivering her second budget inside the House of Commons. A passionate section there about the aid that Canada wants to bring to Ukraine to help Ukraine fight the Russian invasion, the Russian aggressive war that is happening there. $500 million in additional military aid is what has been promised in this budget. But, of course, the budget has been affected, certainly, by what is happening globally. As the budget was being prepared, war broke out, and the government was forced to adjust things, notably around defense spending, which is now up to some $8 billion on top of what had been previously committed by this government. But let's get a better picture, perhaps, of the economic state of this country, the way the government sees it now. And for that, I will bring in Jimmy Jean. He is the chief economist for Desjardins and strategist at Desjardins. Jimmy Jean, nice to meet you, sir. Okay, we're having some audio problems. Hopefully we'll get them going after I ask my first question. Mr. Jean, do you think that the government's projections here in terms of growth and where they can get the deficit over the next number of years are realistic or optimistic or too optimistic?
Well, obviously, what we're seeing in terms of the outlook for deficits is fairly favorable, but it stems from the very strong improvement we've had in the economy over the last year, improving inflation, well, increasing inflation and also commodity prices. So a lot stems from that. And there is also looking at further years, the government is going to pursue its intention to tax banks, to apply that surtax and that recovery dividend on banks. That's going to be where a significant chunk of the extra income will come, but it will also come from things like fighting tax evasion. And that's where, measures of that sort taken in the past, it's not clear whether they've yielded that much benefit. So looking at further years, there are still questions as to whether this is fully realistic.
Okay, I will ask you about those taxes, which affect obviously the people you work for, but let me get your overall impressions of the budget. I think there had been an expectation, perhaps, that it would be a big spending budget. How would you qualify what you saw here today?
Much more contained than what was being envisioned, and much more focused than what we've seen certainly in past budgets from the governments. I think the focus on housing affordability, that was inevitable. It's a number one issue perhaps in this country, and it has for some time. And when you're talking about people in the 25-35 age bracket taking 14 years to be able to accumulate the down payment to buy a first home, this is clearly unacceptable, and we know we're continuing to bring in more immigrants, so that creates more pressure. So that was fine. The question is whether those programs, what they rolled out, really will shift the needle, because let's face it, what they announced today, we've seen much of that in prior budgets without really clear signs that this has a tangible effect, or that they're successful in fixing the hurdles constraining especially affordable and social housing.
One of the things, though, they seem to be focusing on when it comes to housing is not only the things you're talking about to try and help people get into the market, certainly, which is important, but also the issue around supply. So, because you can save up the money, but if there's nothing to buy, or if there's a limited supply, it becomes more problematic. So, for instance, they say they're going to double the current rate of new construction over the next decade. Will that go some way, if they get that done, to improving the housing market, just to make more available so that prices are not so high?
I think it will make a difference, but I'm not yet convinced that this will be sufficient given the amounts that we're expecting in terms of new entrants in our country. And we do need those workers. We are facing labor shortages across Canada, so this is the right way to go. But what I've seen today doesn't really convince me that it will cut it. And let's face it, it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. Yes, there's going to be social and affordable housing, but I think that the crackdowns on foreign buying, on speculation, on also short-term rental activity, which takes away from supply available for Canadians. All these approaches have to be taken, and there has to be a change in relationship between Canadians and home ownership versus renting. We know that in many countries, the population is very comfortable being renters, and they're able to accumulate wealth this way. This has not been our model in Canada, but it's time that we have that conversation as well.
Although there is a new, if I'm not mistaken, I think there's a new rent-to-own portion measure inside this budget too. What did you make of how the government is addressing inflation, the cost of living right now? Obviously, there's no direct measure for putting money in your pocket, but there's a series of programs that they hope will help people overall. Is that enough, or does the country need to get used to long-term inflation because of the instability globally right now?
Right. I think they went in a fairly parsimonious way to try to address that problem. But clearly, this is by far and large a responsibility that's on the Bank of Canada's shoulders. And next week, we expect the Bank of Canada to deliver a 50 basis point rate hikes. It will be the first time it makes such an outsized move on the upside since 2000. So we're really at unprecedented times. We also expect the balance sheet to be reduced very rapidly. So this will have the effect of raising interest rates and slowing down inflation over time. I think that's where we need to see more action. In the part of the government, yes, there can be efforts to assist some of those who will be most affected, but at the same time, you run the risk of generating more inflation. So that's why I think it was the right choice to stay fairly hands-off with regards to inflation and let the Bank of Canada do its job.
Okay. Jimmy Jean, nice to meet you, sir. Thank you for your analysis. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
That is Jimmy Jean. He is a strategist and chief economist at the Caisse des Jardins. I'll bring back Vashi Kapelis and David Cochrane now for more on what they've heard so far. David, if you had to choose one piece of the budget here that stands out and would most affect Canadians, help Canadians, or that Canadians would care about the most, what would you point to?
Well, I think that depends on where you are in Canada and what type of Canadian you are. But I'm going to take a look. I think the housing stuff, just to pick up on what Mr. Jean was talking about, he makes some good points there that they're leaving sort of the inflationary fight to the Bank of Canada. But also, you're not looking at a budget that is going to be at odds with what we consider to be a tightening monetary policy, because this is not expansive, stimulative, fiscal policy, a big spending, $100 billion, get the economy going. It's a more prudent approach, as he said. But I want to zero in on a couple of bits on the housing strategy. And again, I want to go back to this tax-free first home savings account, which I think is very interesting in a couple of ways. If you're a working young Canadian who's got a bit of money to save, this allows you to bank up to $40,000 in an account. It goes in, you get the tax credit like you're investing in an RRSP. A lot of people used to withdraw RRSPs to buy their first home. That's what I did. But then it grows like a tax-free savings account, and when you take the money out, you're not hit on any investment growth. So tax-free going in, tax-free going out. The criticisms of this that we've seen so far is that it's a bit regressive, and that this is a fund and a mechanism that will really only help people who already have disposable income, who might have been able to use those means to get into the housing market in the first place. The second criticism is that this increases the amount of money hunting houses. So if the supply measures, like the housing accelerator and all the other things they're trying to do here to encourage municipalities to accelerate housing construction, if those don't work, you essentially create a mechanism where there's a lot more money chasing a small amount of houses, and that can overheat the market and have an inflationary effect that way. But there's a couple of other things on housing too, Rosie, that I think are interesting. One I'll just touch on is a rental construction financing initiative. And what this does is going back to not buying a house, but being able to have somewhere to live. It offers low interest loans and mortgage insurance to build rental housing. And if a developer comes in with a low rent, energy efficient property, some of that loan gets rebated to them. It gets written off. So there's an incentive there to create energy efficient rentals that would be affordable for a lot of low income people to find somewhere to live.
Yeah, and I should point out there is also a component here for Indigenous communities, $4 billion over 7 years, starting in 2022. That is not what had been asked for. That is a much smaller number than what had been requested, but it is a start, and we will talk about that a little bit later. And Vashi, now that you've had a little more time to have a look here, I guess my question would be around the politics of it. The fact that there is this deal between the NDP and the government, do you see that reflected? And I don't mean in the dental strategy, for instance, but I mean in terms of what the government is trying to do in this document.
Well, to be honest, the only way, or the primary way I see it reflected is through the dental care piece, right? It's really the only thing in that agreement that was so specific that you could hold up the budget against the deal and say, hey, did they do it? The other stuff is largely what the Liberals had signified to some degree that they were going to pursue in any event, like action on climate change, action on housing affordability. I mean, maybe the deal prompted them to do it a little bit faster, or maybe to a greater scale, but it's hard to isolate that and to pinpoint that from a political perspective. You can say that the dental care is there because of the NDP. I'm not sure you can say all the other stuff is as well. I think it prevents it prompts a bit of a challenge for the NDP in their criticism because they are going to have to, for example, rectify what's going on with climate change and some of the measures that the government has embarked on just this week in giving the green light to Bay du Nord, as well as investing or creating a tax break for carbon capture here, which is a kind of capital-intensive way of dealing with, and some say not as effective way of reducing carbon emissions. So I feel like it's not an easy political slam dunk for the NDP, but for the Liberals, they're able to say, hey, we did the dental care thing. Now you're going to support us.
Oh, well, this is a good segue. Jagmeet Singh is speaking right now, so let's see how he balances on this tight wire, Vashi.
And in just transition, real jobs for workers, as well as investing in clean energy, and that's not there. We also see that with healthcare, we want to see investments in a transfer so that we defend our public healthcare system. So those are critiques as well, and we'll continue to fight for Canadians.
Okay, so you said this is the first test. Didn't pass the test. And what's for?
Well, the budget reflects the priorities that we laid out and the agreement that we have. And so it honored that agreement, and it has really important things that are going to make a big difference in people's lives. The expansion of our public healthcare system with a dental care program is going to be life-changing for a lot of Canadians, and we're proud of that. And we're proud of the investments that we were able to achieve in affordable housing. We still have critiques, and we'll still continue to oppose on the approach to the environment, but it is sufficient for our support to continue.
And just on carbon capture, so they have money in that. You know, we still need oil and gas at this point in time. Is that not a good potential solution?
Well, what we've said is that we shouldn't be giving public dollars to profitable companies. And what they're doing effectively in this budget, the government's increasing those subsidies by about $2.6 billion. That's the wrong thing to do. We think that money would be better used in funding clean energy and supporting workers, in training and retraining. There's lots of better ways to spend that money to really move us forward in terms of fighting the climate crisis. So we think that's the wrong approach. And scientists also have raised a lot of concerns around whether carbon capture works, whether we have the technology sufficient to do that in an effective way. So those are real concerns.
Increase in defense spending.
I feel like I always miss you, so I got to go to you now.
Just briefly, since I asked you about it the other day, we couldn't talk about it then. Increase in defense spending, what do you think? It's $8 billion. It's usually not something your party supports. What do you think?
We've laid out a couple of ways where we strongly support that our forces who do important work for us should have the equipment to do that. And there's been clear gaps identified where our armed forces do not have the equipment to do the work they need to do. So that is something understandable. We also have noted that we live in a world that feels less safe. And so increasing investments to be able to do our part, I think, is important. We would have liked to see money invested in humanitarian aid, money invested more in international development. But we did foresee an increase in spending that makes sense. The pharmacare plan in the agreement was for 2023, so we're still on track. We expect to table legislation, the Pharmacare Act, the Canada Pharmacare Act, and have that passed in 2023, and additional steps to follow, including a bulk purchasing plan as well as a formulary. So we still expect that. That's it within the agreement, and that was envisioned for 2023. We strongly believe that people should not have to worry about the cost of medication, and we've delivered on this as well in our agreement, and we hope to see it as per our agreement in next year's legislative agenda.
It's not a concern, though, that you're not foreseeing any expenses on that front? There's no outlay, there's no cash?
It wasn't something that we envisioned this year. In the agreement, it's for next year. We're going to continue to fight for it. We know that every step of the way, we won't be able to achieve these things unless we push and fight to achieve them, and we're confident we can continue to do that.
Okay, that is some initial reaction from the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, who, as we know, about 3 weeks ago struck this deal with the Liberals to support the next number of budgets that they bring forward in exchange for some commitment on policies. He got one of them today, $5.3 billion for dental care for families with incomes of less than $90,000, for kids under 12 this year, and then it expands over time. He said in that scrum that it is, quote, sufficient to win his support. So not a glowing review, but enough that we can all breathe easy. There will not be an election, at least for now. The Conservatives have already made it clear they do not support the budget. Let's bring in Addie Shute right now for some early analysis. We'll get back to them through the special, of course, but just to get their initial thoughts on what they made of this rather slim budget, but perhaps not slim in terms of spending. Depends on where you are. Chantal, I'll start with you. What did you make of it?
Slim budget. It reminded me that this is, by my count, the first budget since 2018 that is neither a pandemic budget or a pre-election budget. It's just a budget. And the message it sent to me is this is the budget of a government that has suddenly bought itself time, and it doesn't need to rush stuff out the door to see if it can get itself re-elected within the next 12 months. I wasn't surprised that you're not seeing beyond the dental care stuff a lot of the NDP, maybe a wish list, or you couldn't draw a very long list. It's one item. Because this is a dynamic agreement, right? If you're going to keep the NDP on side, you need to keep them hoping for more. If you deliver everything on the first budget, there is very little to look forward to, and that probably would doom the agreement. I also listened to the Conservatives in French and English, and it seemed to me that they had prepared a reaction to a budget that did not show up.
I would agree.
In the sense that they were very heavily into this is a huge irresponsible spending budget, and I think the government so far is getting the kind of headlines that it was hoping for, in the sense that it's, reins in spending, which is not what the Conservatives had expected, I believe.
No, I mean, I think there's plenty of things they can criticize around the strategy for growth, how they're dealing with inflation, those kinds of things. But I would agree. I was surprised at the reaction. It seemed out of tune with what is actually in the budget. Andrew, give me your take on what you thought of this budget. As Chantal rightly points out, not full of baubles and things to try and attract voters. Certainly, this is about trying to get some policies in place.
Well, I'm a little mystified to hear it described as a thin budget or parsimonious or any of those adjectives. If you look at the spending track laid out in this budget for the next 5 years, it's up $12 billion a year just from the track they laid out last December. So $60 billion over 5 years. If you compare it to the budget a year ago, 12 months ago, it's up more than $20 billion a year. So, and it wasn't particularly a parsimonious budget a year ago either. So I think there's a little bit of massaging of the message that's going on here, that what people are looking at the fact that the deficit's lower than they expected. That's because revenues are up so much. It's not because they've been reining in spending. What I will say is it's good news that the Liberals have discovered that we have a growth problem in this country. So there's a lot of rhetoric in here and some policies about raising our long-run growth track as a country. The bad news is they still don't really seem to have much idea what to do about it. The stuff on productivity, another public investment fund, albeit at arm's length, another innovation agency on top of the dozens we already have. This does not strike me as particularly new or bold or fresh thinking.
Well, and they lack details. Both the Canada Growth Fund, which is supposed to do that, and the Canadian Innovation and Investment Agency, both of those in the budget say, hey, we'll give you more details later in the year or in the fall update. So you're right, Andrew. They recognize there's an issue, but aren't quite on the path to fixing it yet. Althea, your thoughts about what you read today?
I'm going to pick up on the opposition reaction because that's what we just heard. To me, it's so bizarre that Jagmeet Singh is basically doing almost a better job of selling this budget than the government itself. You could easily imagine that he could be tearing this budget apart and saying that he would not support it, in thinking about the amount of money the government is pouring into the carbon capture and storage investment tax credit, the fact that they are not moving on long-term care, for example. So he's like propping up a budget to find a reason to support it. Meanwhile, Chantal is absolutely right. It does seem like Candace Bergen's lines were written before anyone had actually seen this budget. I mean, she's saying things that are factually not true, like the fact that she says that all the money from inflation, the additional revenues, is all being spent. Well, that's actually not true. So it is shocking that she is painting it in an irresponsible way, because you could imagine that what Gérard Deltel was saying in French about how, well, they're not building a house right now and they're not giving people money in their pocket to deal with inflation. Well, if the Liberals had done that, I'm sure the Conservatives would be criticizing them for, well, you're printing more money by giving people direct funds and spurring demand when we don't need it, and you're saying you're building houses right away when we know it's impossible for you to do that. So, the budget is a communication exercise, and the opposition parties are posturing. But generally speaking on the budget, I would say it shows a remarkable amount of restraint. I think that is the surprise for some. I did not expect to see have just campaigned on.
Yeah, I guess it's all relative, right? We are now really used to massive amounts of spending. And so when we see, to Andrew's point, when we see what it is now, we're like, oh, well, that doesn't seem so bad. But I guess the Conservatives' point would be, no. We've all gotten out of hand because we've lost our perspective. I can see Chantal wants in, then I'll go to Elamine.
I just want to say that it looks to me, thinking about what Althea said about the Conservatives, it looks to me like they did to themselves the same thing they did 2 years ago, almost a year and a half, to vaccines. They so built expectations that there would be no vaccines that the government came out looking good. And they spent the past 2 weeks so saying this will be an open bar of spending that the government ends up looking restrained. And I agree with Andrew, it's not particularly restrained, but it doesn't live up to the caricature that the main opposition party built.
Okay, Elamine, your take on what you've read so far, and whether it addresses, I guess, the main concerns of Canadians right now, which is how do I afford to live and afford my life right now?
I think there's a certain perspective that we have to take in mind when Andrew says that the budget is going to be $12 billion for every year. I've completely lost track of whether that's a significant amount or not after the last couple of years of spending. But I think there are two things that I want to remind us of here, which is the idea that the debt to GDP ratio is going to be their fiscal anchor, the thing that sticks around for the next little while. I think that's significant. It's by no means anyone's favorite metric, but the fact that they have something that they're sticking to, I think is worthwhile. It insulates them against the accusation that they're completely freewheeling here. Then the second thing is what David Cochrane was talking about before, which is that this is not a budget that has this big initiative that says, okay, here's a direct stimulus, here's some kind of direct stimulus coming to your bank account. That also insulates them against, when we're gearing up for this big fight against inflation, against this accusation that they're just willing to spend as much money as possible. So I think those are two big things. With regards to the housing initiatives, listen, these are significant by any measure, of course, are significant. But I want to remind us that this government launched a housing strategy in 2017, and they said that this was going to be a 10-year plan. Well, by my math, and I'm not amazing at math, but we are halfway through that, and we're finally seeing some kind of significant movement when it comes to that regard. I hear Chrystia Freeland when she says there is no silver bullet when it comes to housing, but we would usually have an opposition party that would say, you know what, if you had started a little bit earlier, we wouldn't necessarily need a silver bullet. Well, we're starting now, and I guess it's our job to say, maybe if you started earlier, you wouldn't need that silver bullet.
Andrew had a chuckle there, so I'll go to him to riff off of that.
Just one area where I certainly think spending came in under expectation, and that was on the military. We're in the midst of the worst global security crisis since the Second World War, teetering on the edge of who knows what kind of cavern in front of us with the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And the total increase in spending is $8 billion over 5 years. It'll bring spending from military spending from 1.4% of GDP to 1.5% of GDP in 5 years. I get the sense they were kind of caught between wanting to spend more on the military perhaps and wanting to spend more on the social envelope, and they kind of split the difference and gave a little bit to each. But I'm not sure they're really satisfied either camp in that regard.
Well, and they said they were going to do things like modernize NORAD, but they didn't lay out specifically how that's going to be done. About 20 seconds, Chantal, then I got to take a quick break.
On defense, I thought the most interesting thing was their realization that they actually need to give themselves a defense review of the policy before they decide where they're going. And it does speak to the fact that we do not actually have one.
Okay, we will leave it there with all of you, but you will be back a little bit later in the show for more talk. Maybe we can talk more about fiscal anchors and how we should interpret the way they're approaching fiscal anchors this time around. Thank you, Chantal, Andrew, Althea, and Elamine, talking a little bit. As we're telling you, this is the government's budget for 2022, Chrystia Freeland's second budget, which many are describing as not the biggest spending budget that they've seen, largely in light because this is in many ways a post-pandemic budget. This is the first budget where the government is not putting in place a lot of emergency measures to deal with the fact that there have been lockdowns or problems in the economy. And so they are pumping money into other areas, daycare, dental care, and housing. On that note, we are going to say a quick goodbye to viewers in Atlantic Canada on CBC Television. Special coverage continues, though, for the rest of the country on CBC News Network and CBC Gem. All right, and if you are joining us, we're continuing our coverage now of the government's 2022 budget. One, remember that they struck a deal with the NDP about 3 weeks ago in order to secure their support. In fact, Jagmeet Singh says that it is sufficient for his party to support the government, and of course, that means an election will be averted. It also means that at least one of the significant promises the NDP had been hoping for is in this budget, and that is dental care for kids under 12 in low-income families. I believe we are going to let's go back to David and Vashi at this time now to talk a little bit more and riff off a little bit more of what we've heard from At Issue and others. David, I'll start with you. Let's talk, I guess, a little bit about Jagmeet Singh's reaction. Because Vashi had been wondering how he would respond, and I guess that's it. It's not. There's still criticism, but it's criticism it's careful criticism, I guess, is how I would describe it.
Well, I think the line that really jumps out is, it is sufficient for our support to continue. And I think that's really the one that matters in the context of this. I mean, Chantal made a very good point that this is the first budget in a long time that wasn't either preparing for an election or dealing with a pandemic or both, as was the case, in one of those elections, that you lose track of. I'm like Elamine now with the $12 billion. You forget how many elections that we've had. I think what is interesting here is with this budget, you have to sort of, and with the way the Liberals have managed the budgets on their economic plan, you kind of have to plot the constellations together across a series of budgets. And we got a bit of an explanation of sort of how they see their whole long-term economic growth plan rolling out in the briefing today from senior finance officials as they walked us through this. A key underpinning of Canada's economic growth plan is immigration, right? We're looking at a high immigration target of 451,000 permanent residents coming to this country each year by 2024. Well, if you're going to bring a lot of people into this country to juice the population and fill the job market, you need things like childcare and you need things like housing as the infrastructure to allow that to happen. The investments in housing, the investments in childcare, they believe allows people to live in Canada's more expensive cities, and vibrant cities are an important economic engine in driving growth in an economy. Also, when you're going to bring a lot of people into the country, you have to invest in things like training so they can skill up and have the capacity, along with people are already here, to take the jobs of the transitioning economy. There's $3 billion over 3 years last year for about $500,000 training opportunities. And so I want to focus a little, if I can, about that transition, that green transition that we're going to go through and the measures they have here to try to do this. I'm going to focus on the two new agencies that they announced, the Canada Growth Fund and the Canadian Innovation and Investment Agency. Because the issue is that the climate transition is happening, Rosie, and is Canada either going to be a poorer country when it happens, or is it going to be a prosperous country? So the Canada Growth Fund seeks to answer that question. It's $15 billion over the next 5 years. The goal is to get $3 from the private sector for every $1 invested to finance projects that reduce emissions, diversify the economy and exports to low carbon industries and low tech, and to support restructuring of critical supply chains. And an example of that is rare minerals, for example, investing in that to make mines and processors viable so you can do things like make car batteries here in the country. And the motivation here is to build a net zero economy by 2050. Well, to do that, Canada needs about $125 to $140 billion in capital each year in clean tech to get there. Right now, we're averaging between $15 and $25 billion a year. So you can see the size of that task. So this is the ambition of this, the Canadian Innovation and Investment Agency, which we're going to get more details on in the fiscal update in the fall. So that's the hope. The challenge, as Andrew and others point out, and we heard from like the Canadian Business Council when we were speaking to them earlier today, is these are more agencies adding to the alphabet soup of ACOA, BDC, Innovation Fund, you know, all of this that makes it complex. And the question is, how quickly can these get up and running? The infrastructure bank took years before it started to have a meaningful impact. And when you're dealing with the climate transition, you kind of don't have years, so you need these to move fast.
Yeah, and as you say, it's very clear in the budget that the growth fund is coming in the fall. They're going to give us more updates in the fall. And the Innovation and Investment Agency, same thing. They need to do further consultation to figure out how it's going to work. So as we were saying with that issue, some road towards solutions, but not implementing them yet. Although the critical minerals issue, which may sound obscure, but actually makes a lot of sense. It's something that Canada has a lot of, and it could go in and fill in supplies from China, for instance, and make sure that there is a reliable supply chain for our allies. And as you point out, is sort of critical to fighting climate change, making electric vehicles and electric vehicle batteries and stuff. So you can see how that, you know, could be important for Canadian innovation, but the timelines, to your point, seem not immediate. I think that would be generous to say that.
Yeah, and when you look at one of the criticisms, you know, that and Chrystia Freeland tried to speak to this in her speech, where he said they've been criticized for low productivity and an unambitious economic agenda. Canada writ large, not just this government, and not really having sort of these are our three anchor industries, and this is what we're going to invest in. Well, if you look at what's happened over the last couple of weeks in Ontario, in particular, with the investments in car plants and electrical vehicle manufacturing, you see Doug Ford and François-Philippe Champagne and everybody together. It's very clear. The auto sector has been important to our economy for the last few decades. The electric vehicle industry is going to be important too, so they're betting on that, and the minerals are a big part of that because you get domestic security of the supply chains and you get the jobs here. And that's, you know, we've gone through questions of supply chain security during the pandemic. You can't get masks, you can't get PPE because they're made in China and all of the challenges there. And with the instability right now happening globally, you don't want to set up your future industries to be subject to those same geopolitical risks. And so investing in this here and having the processing done here and then the manufacturing done here is all part of sustaining what's going to be a key industry for the North American market for the next century.
And if you're tuning in because you expected Power and Politics, it's coming up very soon. We're in our budget special right now, but Vashi will have interviews with all the people you want to hear from and all the difficult questions that need to be asked. But Vashi, what did you make of what Jagmeet Singh had to say there in terms of balancing criticism and support?
I feel like it was exactly as I anticipated. Thanks for doing dental care. That allows me to support the budget if I'm Jagmeet Singh. But I do have some major concerns, and actually they've been echoed in particular by the Bloc Québécois as well, Yves-François Blanchet, the leader of that party, around the climate change measures in this budget. In particular, the investment or the tax break, the amount of money going towards a tax break for carbon capture and storage. There are certainly questions, A, about the amount of capital it takes, the amount of money it takes basically to have carbon capture work on a broad scale, and how effective it is as a result. And so he highlighted that as a concern. That's not a surprise. I mentioned just yesterday the government gave the green light to the Baie du Nord deep water oil endeavor off the coast of Newfoundland. That is going to, you know, regardless of all the environmental arguments that are being made for it, and many of them are very factual, at the end of the day, it's up to 200,000 barrels rather of oil extra that wasn't being produced, that will be produced. And so somehow Jagmeet Singh has to square all of that with his support of the government, which seems to hinge at this point almost entirely on the fact that dental care was included in this budget. And so I feel like it's an interesting political tightrope to see him walk going into the future, because there are lots of things that NDP say that they value around the issues of climate change, for example, around even other issues in healthcare. There's nothing in here for provinces around transfers beyond what already has been transferred. And so, you know, outside of the dental care, I think, you know, not really, his reaction definitely didn't come as a surprise. Like, as David said, you know, you have my support, a sufficient level of it, but stuff I'm still worried about.
Yeah, and much to come. We should point out that the deal certainly didn't say all must be done within the first year. Clearly, these are policy bits that have to be done over time. But you're right to point out the climate issue. That seems like a challenging way for challenging thing for the NDP in the weeks ahead. Okay, I'm going to come back to both of you later. Thank you so much. As we've been talking a lot about, the government did dedicate a large portion, $10 billion, to housing affordability in this country, supply, and helping people get into the market. Here's a bit on the state of buying and renting right now in Canada.
The last few years, it's kind of set in like, maybe I'll just realistically rent my whole life.
Canadian home prices are up more than 20% in the past year alone, with the average selling price topping $800,000, the highest it's ever been. Recent record low mortgage rates and bidding wars in hot markets like Toronto and Vancouver are driving up prices. Rental prices are also on the increase.
Over the past 2 years, we've seen the pandemic increase the need for affordable housing.
During the fall election, the Liberals promised to help get more Canadians into the market, promising a rent-to-own program, building more affordable homes, and cracking down on foreign ownership.
Okay, let's bring in Sophie Normand right now. She's a young professional who's been renting an apartment in Ottawa for the last 8 years and is concerned, like many people, about housing affordability for young people across the country. Sophie, nice to meet you. Hello.
Hi, Rosemary, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I don't know that you've read the whole budget at this stage, but from what we've been showing and talking about, did you see anything in there that you could say to yourself, oh, that actually could help me?
Yeah, I mean, I will admit, haven't had a chance to read it yet, but hope to do that soon. But I am encouraged to see that the government is at least talking about investing in housing and making it more affordable for Canadians. Like you said, I rent an apartment, and I'm one of those young Canadians that would love to buy a house someday. But with the way the housing market is right now, I don't even know if that's going to be a reality. So the fact that the government is putting investments into that is encouraging for me.
What beyond the price issues, is it also an issue of like you can't find anything that would work for you? So it's not only your price, but the kind of house that you would need. If, for instance, if you were willing to move into a co-op or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, at least, part of the problem, like you said, is the price, but it is also not finding something that I would want. And it's hard to be in the position of having to sort of choose between something that I might want, something that I don't want, and trying to find something that fits in my price range too.
Would you be comfortable renting for the rest of your life, Sophie?
I would be. And like I said, the reality is I'm kind of facing that I might have to, at least for a little bit longer than I'd hoped to.
So one of the things that was in there, in case you didn't hear it, but it was an election commitment from the Liberals, was this tax-free first home savings account that would give you, it's sort of like a TFSA, that would give you the ability to put up to $40,000 in there and you wouldn't be taxed on it going in or out. Is that something you could see yourself taking advantage of?
Realistically, I think I'd take advantage of whatever help that I could get.
So would you have money to save on top of whatever else you're doing?
I would like to. That's definitely the goal. It's a tough position to be in, because it's not for lack of having a good job, not for lack of wanting to save or trying to save. It's just really, really hard for a lot of young Canadians, myself included, and for a lot of my friends. We have these conversations on a regular basis of, wouldn't it be nice to own a home? Wouldn't it be nice to be able to save? But, with the price of gas, with the price of groceries even, it's becoming a lot harder to even do that.
For sure. And one of the other things that the government tried to address in this budget is supply. So just trying to really increase the number of homes that are available. And I wonder, is this a situation where you are prepared to wait 10 years if needed for the market to cool, for there to be enough inventory, and for you to have the money to do it?
I think that like I said, is the position that a lot of young Canadians are finding themselves in, myself included. A lot of my friends as well, that, we're waiting a little bit longer than maybe we'd wanted to, because we want to be able to afford something.
And just last point, beyond what you may or may not have heard so far, what would you say to the Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister about how you and your friends are thinking about things these days?
I think I'd say that a lot of us are feeling a bit of a crunch right now, and that, I know that she had said at one point there's no one silver bullet solution. And I personally agree with that. But I think that we need help. Young Canadians need help to be able to break into the housing market, to be able to afford a home someday. And I would hope that they would concentrate on that.
Okay, Sophie Normand, nice to meet you. Good luck. Maybe we'll check in and see whether it happens for you anytime soon. Appreciate it.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Thanks, Rosie.
Okay, bye-bye, Sophie. All right, let's bring in personal finance expert Preet Banerjee in Toronto. He's here to help us understand how this might help Canadians and their day-to-day living. Nice to see you again, Preet.
Hey, Rosie.
So obviously, this is what people are concerned about right now is how to make ends meet, or even people who have good jobs and make good money. They're still noticing high prices at the gas pump, high prices at the grocery store. That is, of course, because of inflation, because of the war in Ukraine. Did you see anything in here where you said to yourself, oh, well, this will make a difference for people right now?
I think, the dental care was probably the first thing that would stand out. I guess it's related to how much your kids flush and broth or flush and
brush and floss, yes.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. And other than that, not really a lot. I think the thing that stuck the most to me was this is going to be great for the financial literacy industry because this new, let me see if I got this right, tax-free first home savings account, TFFHSA, which is like an RSP on the way in and a TFSA on the way out. Right. I'm thinking to myself, why didn't you just relax the requirement to repay the home buyer's plan as part of the RSP? Because that would have done the exact same thing. But beyond that, this looks regressive. It really helps the people who are in a position to save more money into this. So I think that, when it comes to the measures with respect to housing affordability, I'm not going to say too little, too late. I'm going to say it's something, but it's still too late because we've been living in this area of chronic housing unaffordability. And now it's been acute, especially in the last 2 years with house prices increasing 50% during the pandemic. And then in the last 6 months with mortgage rates rising now, that's going to do more to cool housing than anything proposed in this budget.
So beyond the housing measures, do you see anything in there where people would feel like they were getting some support? The government would say, well, we've now created this national childcare plan, as you point to. There's dental care and there's other measures like that. Does that overall help someone when they're, trying to do their own personal budget?
Yeah, so of course the childcare was announced a while ago. It's going to take a while to phase in, so that certainly is going to be very welcome. But what are people going to do with the money that they save? They're going to put that into, a bidding on houses. So a number of these measures are actually going to contribute to pushing up prices. And so in terms of affordability right now as a Canadian, based on what I've seen here, there's nothing that's going to say, hey, it's cheaper now when I go grocery shopping. It costs me less to get around town because the price of fuel is so high. Nothing really is going to change in the very short term. And again, we're facing sort of these acute issues.
Sure. So I guess my question would be, what can a government do, right? This is the highest inflation rate since 91, about 30 years. There's a lot of factors going into that. And, we were talking to an economist off the top, Jimmy Jean, who said, the government sort of has to leave this in the hands of the Bank of Canada. They're going to raise their interest rates probably later next week. So what can a government actually do to address inflation?
Yeah, I think they've sort of taken the approach that it is maybe something that the Bank of Canada can handle with their monetary policy, at the same time hoping that, if you're on team transitory for inflation, that it starts to come back down naturally as supply chains start to open up. And hopefully if there's more oil supply, that brings down the cost at the pump. And that hopefully will solve more problems than anything that they could have done. And the other thing to consider is that had they acted more aggressively on housing is such a key part of the economy now because it has been so prosperous for so long. The number of people working in real estate related industries is so much higher. So if you did anything drastic, you're actually affecting the economy very negatively as well because so many people's jobs are tied to the real estate industry.
Sure. Okay, Preet Banerjee, nice to see you again. Appreciate you making the time for us today.
Anytime.
That's Preet Banerjee. He is a personal finance expert in Toronto. As we've been talking about, one of the components, one of the things that influenced this budget, of course, is the war in Ukraine. It's sort of restarted a conversation about whether this country is spending enough on the military and military supplies, and NATO, for instance. The Department of National Defence will be getting $8 billion now in new money in this budget. Here's a look at where Canada stands right now when it comes to military spending.
Canada is facing increasing pressure to boost defense spending as Russia wages a brutal war against Ukraine. In 2014, NATO nations agreed to increase military spending to at least 2% of GDP by 2024.
I expect all allies, including Canada, to make good on the promises we have made.
But Canada is still below NATO's target. Ottawa spent less than 1.4% of its GDP on the military last year.
I think we also have to remember that Canada's contribution militarily must be recognized not only in terms of our NATO commitments, but also in terms of our commitment to the current crisis in Ukraine.
All right, let's bring in defense analyst David Perry. He's the president of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He was in the lockup helping us out, understanding things. Good to see you again. So give me your take on whether, I mean, it's certainly more than we would have had there not been a war in Ukraine. I think that's fair to say. But does the adjustment address the reality that we're in right now, Dave?
So it's an amount of money that would have been a pleasant surprise, I think, at the beginning of February. But I think given all the comments from the government in the last several weeks, it's a bit of a surprise in terms of how they'd set expectations for spending that were quite a bit higher than what were reflected here. There have been cabinet ministers talking about potentially meeting or exceeding 2% of GDP going towards defense. And what the document doesn't actually state, but the senior officials talking about it made mention of, is that if everything goes according to plan, then maybe this will see us get to about 1.5%. So a lot lower than expectations have been seeded.
I mean, to be fair, no one told me we were going to hit 2% in the weeks leading up to this. They told me there was no way that was going to happen because it would have been, I think, look, we're talking tens of billions of dollars more if that was the goal. So the places where they seem to be putting the money, or how much do we know about where that money is going? Maybe that's a better question, Dave.
So for the bulk of it, about $6 billion is really not much detail at all. So there's about $900 million going towards cyber defense. I mean, that's an area where we could definitely use extra resources. A fair amount of money going towards the war in Ukraine. And actually in the short term, we're committing more money to the defense of Ukraine than we are to the defense of Canada itself specifically this next year.
One of the things where they had been telegraphing that were going to make some moves was on modernizing NORAD. It doesn't look like there's additional funds here beyond what was promised in the previous year, over 5 years, and they sort of lay out the things they're thinking about. Was that expected, that it would take them some time to figure out what to do, or does that speak to maybe the way they've had to retool their thinking given what's happening in Ukraine?
So there's, I guess the way I would put it, there's money here that could be going towards some of that continental defense, some of that NORAD spending, but it isn't actually specifically discussed, and it's basically lumped together as part of a pod, including NATO spending, including equipment and technology spending that it might go to, but there's no detail on it. I was expecting to see some specifics because we've been working on that file for a while. You know, I could understand if we weren't having the full set of details, but there was specific money, as you said, in last year's budget. So it's a little curious to not see any specifics this year for NORAD or the continent.
Let me ask you about the defense policy review, the fact that they now want to do a fairly rapid defense policy review in light of the changes that we've seen globally. Did that surprise you? How quickly could that get done, do you think?
I think rapid's in the eye of the beholder. You know, that can go in about a year. You know, it all depends on how extensive they want to make it, whether or not it'll be open in public, which has been what the government did the last time. That will take longer. I think part of the difficulty is we're kind of off cycle with the fiscal year. So even if they can do a full review and have the answer and be ready to announce it in a year, we kind of missed a full fiscal year worth of planning. So it'll be basically 2 years before you could start seeing at a minimum the impact of anything that goes through a process like that if they do it. And it's kind of strange to, at this point, have a government that's launching a second defense policy review, which if they do a full one would be the first time any Canadian government's ever done that. But it's bizarre to do that and not do a foreign policy or a wider national security review at the same time.
Okay, David Perry, nice to see you again to comment on all of this for us. Appreciate it. The president of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute in Ottawa. Good to see you. Thank you so much. All right, we are going to talk a little bit more about this budget and some of the highlights for you as Canadians, of course. Much of it about housing affordability, something that many of you are struggling with or thinking about. Some things, too, to deal with how you can afford other things in your life. Dental care is one of them, and tackling the inflationary crisis in this country, as well as talking about long-term economic growth in the years ahead. David Cochrane is here now, and I think he's going to talk to us a little bit about potential economic risk, because you make a plan, but as we've seen over the past 3 years, doesn't mean that that's what goes ahead.
Yeah, it was very clear in the conversations with finance officials today, Rosie, and even in the Deputy Prime Minister's speech, that there's just a lot of uncertainty, and Dave Perry was just talking about a lot of it. And they spelled out some key risk factors today as to basically where this could all go wrong, because it is a somewhat optimistic economic scenario. 4 big risk factors: Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the impact on supply chains based on COVID's resurgence in China, because cases are up in China, which is an important manufacturing and export hub, the effects of supply and labor shortages on supply chains, and the impact of rising interest rates on the Canadian economy. We fully expect the Bank of Canada to raise rates by another half point next week to deal with inflation. All of that has a knock-on effect, and there's a heightened impact scenario spelled out in this budget around pages 18 and 19 for those of you reading along at home. and what it warns us about is that if the conflict in Ukraine, for example, becomes long and drawn out, you're going to see increasingly elevated commodity prices, particularly on the energy side, prolonged supply chain disruptions. You're going to see a rapid monetary policy tightening because you're going to have inflationary pressures from all of this. Russian energy exports are going to drop. You're going to see prices spike, and then you're going to see spikes in global interest rates and in inflation rates. And all of that has obviously a catastrophic effect on what could happen with this Canadian outlook because of the impact in, for example, Europe, where there's some concern about either a stagflation period or maybe even a recession period in the European Union caused by all of this because of their dependence on Russian energy. And there's scenarios laid out there where, ironically, if the worst case scenario happens, the deficit is lower this year because you get a lot of extra money from high oil prices, as a major oil producer Canada is, but then it just craters throughout the oncoming years. And we're talking about a deficit that was low of $8 billion by 2026. Under this scenario, it would be over $20 billion. So you see that level of risk is there. Now, the hope, obviously, is things de-escalate very quickly in Ukraine, and you could actually see significant improvement in the economic outlook here. But all of those things, it just shows how acutely vulnerable the Canadian economy and the financial projections are, even as we kind of move through the pandemic or through the pandemic restrictions. And that is the warning that is there, that there's still a lot of risk and a lot of volatility, and as optimistic and as certain as this is today, there is a lot of uncertainty underneath it that could change the picture dramatically if things go south.
And what kind of buffer exists then to deal with that in case things do destabilize further?
Yeah, there's no contingency fund baked into the deficits, but there are, what they're doing now instead is they're giving us a heightened impact scenario and a moderate impact scenario is what they call them. So you can adjust your spending. We're seeing that with the infrastructure money in this budget, Rosie. It was once a centerpiece of the economic agenda. It was supposed to really essentially stop funding new programs by 2027. They're moving that out now to 2033. So that's going to smooth out some of the deficits in the short term and push out infrastructure spending into the long term. I think a hard lesson they learned is that there's only so much construction capacity in every province, and it's hard to be as aggressive and ambitious on infrastructure as you want to be with the conditions and timeline approval issues you have at the federal government level. But there's always money like that you can reprofile, to use the jargon, which essentially means spend later or not spend at all.
Yeah. What is kind of, I guess, startling, although maybe not, is that they don't really even talk about public health measures or COVID until Chapter 6. It is not. It is no longer the focus, the primary focus of the budget. Chrystia Freeland made it clear that they are well aware that emergency measures need to be pulled back and turned off because we are in a different phase of the pandemic. Doesn't mean there isn't money for some of these public health measures, including increasing the stockpile, for instance, making sure that the Public Health Agency is prepared to better detect these kinds of things going forward. But would you say that we've sort of seen the end of budgets that are about the pandemic because we seem to have moved on, or we've at least decided that that lockdowns aren't happening, and so the economy can open up in a broader way?
I think certainly on the scale of the ones we've seen over the last couple of years that we've covered, it looks that way. I mean, who knows where this virus is going next, Rosie? I mean, getting a note today from my kid's school, there's like a 25% absentee rate, and they're canceling classes for entire grades because so many teachers are sick. So who knows where this goes? But like, there's $2 billion in this budget to clear up the surgery backlog, $430 million over 5 years for better surveillance and risk of the next disease that causes us all kinds of problems. And as you said, about $50 million to restock and maintain the Public Health Agency of Canada emergency stockpile. So there are a lot of things like that there, and sort of the legacy of the pandemic, cleaning up after the pandemic, fixing the warning system gaps that were exposed by the pandemic. And there are some things that help. There are supports here, smaller supports, for example, for the tourism sector and other sectors that are still recovering and coming back, tens of millions of dollars over a couple of years. But nothing like what we saw with these, you and me and Vashi back in March of 2020 and into that spring, just rolling out billions and billions and billions of dollars in new programs a day. We seem to have moved past that. Hopefully it stays that way.
Okay, David Cochrane, thank you so much. We will come back to you a little bit later. I'll bring in At Issue now for another round. Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj, Elamine Abdul-Mahmoud. Chantal will be back on the National tonight. She's off doing a panel in her mother tongue, in French. Let's talk a little bit about some of the fiscal guardrails. I'll start with you, Andrew, on that, because those lines sort of struck me in the beginning of the budget where, and even in the speech when Chrystia Freeland said that the fiscal anchor is the debt to GDP ratio, that it's a line that they cannot cross, that they have to make sure finances remain sustainable, and that they are committed to doing that. I mean, obviously that was a political message as much as anything, but what did you make of why it was said that way and whether they can do it, I guess?
Well, it was good to see the guardrails were back. They'd kind of dropped out of sight for a while, but I guess now that they can announce that we're back to pre-pandemic levels of employment and output, that's a good news story. The guardrails were supposed to mean the end of stimulus, and we certainly stopped hearing about stimulus in this budget. It's only mentioned once in the entire document, but strangely, we're spending more than we did when the stimulus was on. So again, it's hard for me to see the restraint in here. If we've actually reached levels of employment output that exceed our pre-pandemic levels, then why aren't we spending more than we did then? Why is this? When, if ever, do the spigots ever get turned off? When in bad times we're told we got to spend because we have to stimulate the economy, and now that we're in good times we're told, well, we've got all this money, we might as well spend it. And this way, they've got a nice looking chart that shows the debt to GDP ratio going down over the next 30 years, and in fact going down at a much sharper rate than in previous. But any kind of chart that can move that rapidly in the good direction can also flip just as quickly in the bad direction. They've kind of priced this to perfection in the sense that even in their worst case scenario, they don't actually factor in a recession. It's just slower growth. We could be in a recession right now for all we know.
Yeah. Although, are they committing, and I'm asking this because I honestly don't know, are they committing to this kind of spending still because they believe that it provides growth, that it is what fuels growth in this country?
They're not arguing in those kind of Keynesian stimulus terms in this budget. They have in previous budgets. Now the spending supposedly is investment in growth, but if you actually look at most of the spending here, it's not actually for things that spur longer term growth. It's the usual programs, and they may be very worthy programs individually or collectively, but they're basically distribution programs, not investments in higher output.
Okay. Althea, your thoughts on those fiscal guardrails and how important it was, I guess, politically to signal that the government is committed to them and believes that they are still important?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I see it exactly the same way as Andrew. So
good.
On
we like
the
disagreement.
Debt to GDP, on the debt to GDP ratio, I would have been shocked, frankly, if she would have abandoned that. And why would she? Because she has all this revenue, so the numbers look great. What is interesting is to see her walk back the guardrails that she had set out in the past in terms of full employment. And so we are seeing the Liberals argue that, yes, we don't need stimulus on the demand side, but we believe that we should be spending money on the supply side, and that we are going to help grow the economy, and that's the direction in which we're spending the money. And you can see the carbon capture and utilization storage investment tax credit in that lens, not just as I mean, some would probably argue that it's not a climate policy, but it's an investment policy, and that you're hoping that it's going to attract more investment, as we've already seen in Alberta, for example, and that perhaps we will spur innovation in that section, in that sector, pardon me, and that that will help further grow the economy and grow coffers. What's interesting to me, frankly, is what's not in the budget, and we kind of talked about that a little bit, but you know, when the Liberals came in to office, they talked a lot about the income gap, and so much of the past budgets have been focused on poverty and income redistribution, and this is not a budget that is at all in that direction. Even things that the Liberals are still committed to doing, like reforming employment insurance or reforming the disability benefit, like the disability benefit is not even mentioned in this budget. So it is very clear that Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister, is trying to focus, and I think maybe we could see perhaps some leadership politics between the lines here, and refocus that she is not a tax and spend Liberal. She is a responsible Liberal in the Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin vein, and that she is not going to run crazy deficits that will plunge the country into unmanageable finances for decades to come.
Okay, I have to do a quick break. It's my only break. I'm going to do a quick break, and Elamine, would you all just stay there? When we come back, we'll talk more a little bit about fiscal anchors and whether this speaks to, well, as you pointed out, if this is a return to the way Liberals used to do budgets, or whether there's something else going on here. Nice to see Andrew and Althea out of their homes and actually on location in Lockhart.
Talking to each other in real life.
I know that they like to leave their homes occasionally. Okay, we'll take a short break. We'll come back with a little bit more of that issue right after this. Stay there. Hello, I'm Rosemary Barton here in the nation's capital, bringing you live coverage of Budget 2022. Let's bring back the At Issue panel for a little more talk on what they've seen here. Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj, and Elamine Abdul-Mahmoud. Chantal is off on Radio Canada, but we will see her a bit later. I cut everyone off before we got to Elamine when we were talking about fiscal guardrails and whether the government needed to signal here and did signal well enough that it is committed to not overspending and to tackling the deficit, or at least getting the debt to GDP ratio down over time, Elamine.
I mean, I think the bar has definitely changed over the last couple of years, right? Like the sort of the pandemic budgets that we've seen, the expectations, I think, of Canadians to see a major stimulus response to various slowdowns and various economic shutdowns because of the pandemic. I think we're in entirely different territory at this moment. And so this budget does signal that. To Andrew's point, does this budget do anything to signal what Canada wants to do in terms of economic growth? No, I'm not sure that there's anything reassuring there. But Chantal made the earlier point that this is just a budget. It is not an election budget. It is the budget of a government that has a few years to sort of present a plan in that regard. And I think what we've seen today is sort of a building block, and we get to judge how those blocks are being built over the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, they do have both of these growth funds and agencies, but as we've been talking about, things that they plan to flesh out in the months ahead. But maybe that's your point, Elamine, that they have time to say, we'll get back to you on what this is going to look like. Yeah. Okay.
You would conventionally think that you would do the tough stuff and take the bigger risks in a budget like this, where you're not facing an immediate election. So it's a bit of a disappointment from that standpoint.
Okay, I'm going to leave things there for now, but you will be back on the National, so think of all your other smart things you want to say, and we'll see you then for that. Andrew, Althea, and Elamine, nice to see everybody, and I'll see you later tonight. Thanks. Okay, we are going to go back now to Vashi Kapelos for some of her final thoughts about what we've seen here. Vashi's got lots more analysis coming up on Power and Politics, including an interview with Chrystia Freeland to explain some of the choices here. Vashi, we were just talking there with that issue about sort of what this had to signal politically. It does certainly show that this is a government who is comfortable with the reality that it's got some years ahead, and so can make some bigger plans and can take some time in putting some things in place in the right way, hoping, I guess, to David Cochrane's point earlier, that things don't go sideways and that what we're seeing play out in the world doesn't have a drastic impact on the economy here in this country.
Well, I mean, at this point, it isn't to a certain degree. It's certainly affecting supply chains, and that's impacting inflation. And that is something that I think Canadians are concerned about and wondering how this budget will address. But overall, big picture, the economy is still doing very well in this country, which is why they'll also face criticism for continuing the levels of spending, though they're a bit more restrained than they have been in the past, that they are right now. So I think politically it is, as all your panelists have pointed out, something that they are leveling, knowing that they have some time ahead of them, that they don't have to campaign, for example, on this budget. But I think, there are to me, two big questions that pop out. The first is around the affordability and the housing agenda. They announced a big housing plan, as Elamine pointed out, in 2017. It did not materialize anywhere close to what they were promising. So, will they be able to make good on this in a way that does actually impact the housing market, which is, a very tangible, troubling thing for a lot of Canadians. And then second, on the defense spending, I'm curious, because of the defense minister saying she was going to put forward these options for even more than 2% spending, why they ended up choosing what they did. So I certainly will be asking the minister about that coming up ahead on Power and Politics.
Okay, and you're also talking to the interim Conservative leader, and I would imagine the leader of the NDP as well. So all the coverage that people are going to want to see at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Vashi. We'll see you for that. It's Vashi Kapelos with Power and Politics. Okay, let's get some more reaction to what is in the budget. One of the big spending items in here that we haven't talked much about is around reconciliation. Of course, in the fall fiscal update, there had been a commitment for $40 billion to compensate past harms experienced through Child and Family Services and to put in place long-term reforms to those services. But there is more inside this budget as well, and we've reached the Assembly of First Nations National Chief Roseanne Archibald for that. Nice to see you, Chief.
Thank you, Rosie. Good to be here.
Yeah, I'm going to start with, I guess, one of the larger amounts of money that is in here for the budget. And as I said, there was that prior commitment back in December as part of a legal settlement $4 billion over 6 years to support First Nations children around Jordan's Principle. I guess that's not a surprise to you, because the government had signaled after a lot of pressure that it was going to move to make sure that First Nations children are cared for in the same way as all children. What did you make of that amount, and whether that will deal with some of your concerns around that?
Well, I wanted to first of all talk about the budget in a different way.
Sure.
When we look at this budget in terms of First Nations investments, what we really need is economic reconciliation. We need a new way, a new path forward that allows First Nations, and certainly creates a process where First Nations can benefit from their lands and resources. So I read that there's a $90 billion windfall, and a lot of that comes from commodities like grain, fertilizer, and these things are coming from First Nations lands. So sure. What my question to the government is, when are we going to start talking about a new fiscal arrangement with First Nations? Because, you know, every budget cycle, Rosie, you've heard it many, many times over and over, oh, that's a good investment, but it's not quite enough. Well, we could stop having that cyclical kind of conversation if Canada would live up to its treaty obligations, would live up to what's in the Constitution in terms of rights for First Nations. And certainly having access to the wealth of our lands is one of those things. And when we think about every budget, where is all this money coming from? It's coming from First Nation lands. The fact that, you know, all of Canada sits on First Nations land and all the wealth comes from these lands. Why are we, every time a budget comes around, sure. talking about the same thing, when really we could have a new relationship, a new economic reconciliation, which is what we need?
Okay, I take your broader point. I would point out that there is some, it's surely not as far as you want it to be, but there is some path to that in some sections. For instance, on the critical minerals section, which is mining of natural resources. Obviously, they do commit to a conversation with Indigenous communities there. So. But I take your point that you want it to be a broader conversation going forward. Back to my point, though, on the Jordan's Principle aspect. In your mind, does that go some way to correcting some of the gaps that we see in terms of how First Nations children are cared for?
Yeah, and I just wanted to get back to your point about critical minerals. Like, we need to do more than just have conversations, Rosie. We need processes. I mean, First Nations could be funding these things themselves. And that's what First Nations do when they build wealth. They put it back into their communities. They fund their own processes. And that's where this country has to start heading. We have to move beyond budget cycles to address First Nation issues and create these opportunities, create wealth so that First Nations can have true self-government as promised in the Constitution, as promised through the treaty. So we have to get there. It's not enough to just keep talking about the little, you know, I just said this on another interview. We can always say the same thing. It's a cycle. Well, it's a good start. It's a, you know, it's something, but it's not quite enough. Like, I'm not interested in having that conversation over and over again. We need to move forward on economic reconciliation.
Were you consulted, though, in the budget? I mean, surely you had the ear of the finance minister or others in terms of what you wanted to see or how you want that conversation to change, to your point.
Yeah, we did have some pre-budget consultations with Minister Freeland directly, and I think that process is definitely helpful when it comes to the budget cycle. But we need these larger conversations. We need access to the wealth of our country. This is our land. This is our country. And yet somehow every budget cycle, we're constantly saying that there's not enough, or there's a good investment, but not enough here. I mean, we have to move beyond that. We have to move forward, and that's what reconciliation is supposed to be about.
So maybe you won't like this question either, because I understand the point you're trying to make, but we are operating with what we have today. So let me ask you around the $4 billion over 7 years for Indigenous housing. I know that's a far cry from what you had recommended and asked for and suggested that First Nations people need.
Yeah, again, you know, I really would like us to have perhaps a show about this, Rosie, where we talk about, You know, when we have this a new way of funding First Nations based upon the wealth of this country, then housing, we will take care of that. That's what First Nations do. We take care of our communities, we take care of our people, and certainly these budget cycles are, you know, built and designed to keep us from not moving forward. And we have to start to move forward in this country. I believe that everyday non-Indigenous Canadians know that, and they're trying to find a way forward with all of us. Like, even discussions around this are about the healing path forward we keep talking about. The healing path forward is not only about healing what happened to thousands and thousands of our children being found in unmarked graves, it's also about how First Nations have been treated in this country since the beginning of its inception, and how are we going to change that? How are we going to move forward? I know that people want to help us, and I think that that's what if I could talk to people out there, I'd say talk to your MP and ask them, you know, what are you doing to move this relationship forward? What are you doing so that we can move forward in this country and move forward in a good way where everybody does have access to prosperity, has access to good health care, their children are safe, that they have good housing? Like, where are we? And that's my call to action for other people out there watching.
And to change the nature of the questions I'm asking you, so in a profound way. Message received. Thank you. And let's talk again about it, because you're right. It's a much longer conversation. I appreciate you making the time today. AFN National Chief Roseanne Archibald, thank you so much.
Thank you, Miigwech.
All right, let's go back to David Cochrane now, who wants to talk about something or other. Climate
Welcome
change,
to Budget
maybe?
Day.
Okay, yeah, something else in the budget, yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna walk through some of the climate initiatives that are in this budget. I mean, we talked a bit about the investment measures to try to get big investments in clean growth. I'm gonna walk through a little bit the carbon capture and storage tax credit was there that Jagmeet Singh is not a fan of. And this is a refundable tax credit for business to advance in carbon capture, which is a controversial technology, especially for staunch environmentalists, say it isn't really effective, and it does foster even further fossil fuel developments. They've got a tax credit here ranging from 37 to 60% credit on the investment, depending on what it is, from 2022 to 2023, and then it gets cut in half from 2031 to 2040. And that's because they really want to encourage a quick, rapid uptake in this technology in the next period of time, between now and 2030, when the country is trying to hit its Paris targets of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% below 2005 levels. Now, this is going to be worth about $2.6 billion over 5 years and about $1.5 billion a year after that. This will be criticized inevitably as a fossil fuel subsidy because it'll be used that way. But clearly the government thinks this can work and said today that the time to do it is now, and the oil sector and business sector have the money to do it because of their profits, so they can make this investment on their own. And then there's a series of measures, Rosie, to try to encourage the transition to electric vehicles. We know about the mandates: 20% of light-duty vehicles by 2026, all vehicles by 2026, 60% by 2030, and 100% of light-duty vehicles by 2035. Well, they're going to expand the tax credit incentive. Since 2019, you've been able to get up to $5,000 to lease or buy an electric vehicle. They're going to expand that credit to cover more models: vans, trucks, SUVs, larger vehicles, and more popular vehicles, business vehicles. They're also going to spend a lot more on chargers, especially through the infrastructure bank, which is going to put $500 million in large-scale urban and commercial charging infrastructure. And they're going to come up with $550 million over 4 years to help businesses upgrade their fleets. So medium and heavy duty vehicles, the big trucks that you need to move things around. So they've moved from sort of economy under $45,000 urban dweller cars to reduce emissions, and they're moving into the heavier, more emission-intensive vehicles like F-150s and that kind of thing to help people make the transition. So that's a key part of this as well. That's going to create jobs, that's going to create some technological advancements, but it's going to make it easier just for the average small and medium-sized business and for the average homeowner, car owner, to make that transition to a zero-emission vehicle.
Yeah, and you can see how that goes hand in hand with all those announcements over the past 10 days or so with
create the demand for the supply, right?
That's right.
Exactly.
Exactly that. Okay, David, thank you. We'll come back to you before the end of the show. Appreciate that. Let's talk more about some of the housing-focused elements of this budget, because there sure are a lot of them. We'll bring in Douglas Kwan for that. He's the Director of Advocacy and Legal Services at the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario. It's a community legal clinic specializing in protecting Ontario renters. Nice to see you, Douglas.
Nice to be here.
So I don't know how much you've read, or I imagine you've focused down on the housing section at very least, and I wonder just your thoughts on how let's talk about, first of all, tenants and how, people who are renting, whether it addresses any of the concerns they have, because rental properties are also increasing significantly too.
Absolutely. When you're looking at the affordable housing crisis, you have to look at both renters and owners. And what we saw in this budget is some measures that have been helpful. For example, the Canada Housing Benefit and the Rapid Housing Initiative. But we're hoping for more. We're hoping for investments for non-market rental housing, particularly from the Housing Accelerator Fund. It's a $4 billion fund. We don't have a lot of details with respect to that fund, and we're hoping that some of that is dedicated towards non-market rental housing. We realize that the private market does an excellent job in addressing the needs of the market, but we're hoping that all levels of government, starting with the federal government, focus on non-market rental housing.
There does seem to be $1 billion in loans for rental construction around co-op housing. Is that sort of a recognition that, in spite of the government's commitment to create more housing supply for ownership and to create easier ways into the market, that they also need to create just more affordable ways to have a home at all?
Well, the loans are a great start. It's going to help retain the affordable housing units that are in co-op housing. It doesn't really speak to growing our non-market affordable rental housing stock. There are other measures that are in this budget, such as the review of large corporate entities, such as real estate investment trusts and large corporate landlords and their impact on the affordable housing crisis. We're hoping for more immediate action, but we'll settle for a review.
The $500 payment for those facing housing affordability challenges, they say that they're going to release specifics and delivery methods at a later date. Would you expect that, though, to target renters primarily?
Yes, I believe my understanding it's going to focus on renters who are having significant challenges in renting their home. Renters have had a very difficult time in the market. In Toronto, you need $23 an hour to afford to pay for a bachelor apartment. In Halifax, that's $17, and in Vancouver, it's $25. So, renting is often seen as the first step towards home ownership, and what we're seeing is that renters just can't attain that dream.
No, because you're paying too much in rent to bother saving anything. Just a final word then, Douglas Kwan, on whether you think what is offered here will help people, some of the people that you know and advocate for.
I think we see a lot of long-term solutions, but we're hoping that more immediate solutions will come out of the Housing Accelerator Fund and the review of those large corporate landlords and the real estate investment trusts.
Okay. Douglas Kwan, thank you for making the time for us. Appreciate it. Nice to meet you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
That's Douglas Kwan with the Advocacy Centre for Tenants in Ontario, talking more about housing affordability, something that is on the minds of so many people across this country, and that has there's a lot of measures, at very least, in this budget around housing, whether it be renting supply, trying to create more housing, or just getting into the market if you have the means. A lot of this budget, the Finance Minister, Deputy Prime Minister said, is really about the supply side of the economy, whether it be housing, jobs, innovation, and economic growth. Let's go back to David Cochrane for some final thoughts on today's budget, even though I know you'll have many more thoughts on the national later.
Yeah, Rosie, one thing I think that I look at in this budget is you had a lot of people you call blue liberals, right? The economically conservative liberals who have not really felt at home in the Justin Trudeau Liberal Party with its big tax to the left over the last 10 years almost. And you look at the big spending that we saw during the pandemic with a lot of people being worried that this would become a feature of this government, not necessarily a bug because of a response to a historic health and economic emergency. If you look at the fiscal track of this budget, it does bend back. It's still elevated, but it does bend back towards more of what you would consider a normal budgeting cycle and certainly a deficit level. If you look at the numbers for 2026, you're looking at a deficit of $8.4 billion. Compared to what we've been through, that's really quite insignificant and quite small. But all of that, Rosie, assumes no big new spending.
Yeah.
And I think with this government, we don't want to ever make an assumption that you won't see new big spending, because one thing that's going to start happening right away is Jean-Yves Duclos, Chrystia Freeland, and Justin Trudeau are going to sit down with the premiers to talk about what does the next 10 years of federal health transfers look like? And we know there is a big demand on the table there from the provincial premiers for big increases there. So if you look at this as it is today, and while the spending numbers are way up from what we saw pre-pandemic, you do see an overall reduction in program spending with modest increases over the next 5 years. But between now and 2025, when the confidence and supply agreement with the NDP is set to expire, a lot can happen. That is a long time in politics, 3 years from now. Look at where we were in 2019, which is just 3 years ago. So all of this more conservative and traditional spending, liberal spending patterns is there today, but a lot can happen in the days ahead that could blow that apart, including a prolonged conflict in Ukraine.
Only about 30 seconds, David, but just to name a few of the other things that they've committed to doing with the NDP, pharmacare, healthcare investments, a long-term care act. There are more things that could become big ticket items, to the Conservatives' point. So how they manage that in the years ahead will also be part of the story.
You will need a lot of growth and you will need a lot of revenue if you're going to live up to the letter of those commitments and the spirit of those commitments, because what Jagmeet Singh wants in pharmacare is a big ticket item.
Okay, David Cochrane, thank you so much. We will see you later on The National with everything that Canadians need to know. Appreciate all your help. I'll be back later, too, on The National with an edition of At Issue. Our coverage continues right now on CBC News Network with Vashi Kapelas and Power and Politics, and interviews with the Finance Minister and everyone else that you want to hear from on this critical day. Thank you so much for watching our special coverage of Budget 2022.